Welcome to episode 86 of the Steady On podcast, The Whole Life, with me, Angie Bauman, and my guests today, Eliza Huie and Esther Smith. Eliza and Esther are both biblical counselors who teamed up to write a book to encourage Christians to set a pace they can keep for the long haul. I know we hear it often, but the world we live in can be exhausting. I first sat down with Eliza and Esther a couple months back, and since then I've been using this book in my own spiritual walk. I need constant reminders to take care of my needs, because my needs seem like a nuisance to me. They get in my way, they slow me down. And when I interviewed these ladies, I was coming off of a particularly busy season, even for me, and the Lord used this conversation to invite me to further consideration and correction. The verse I chose for this episode is 1 Peter 4:10. Hear it in the NIV. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. God calls us to serve, but we cannot serve others well with the love of Jesus when we're constantly running on fumes. As I have read through the chapters of this book in the early morning hours, I hear God asking me to reevaluate my needs. Instead of being a burden, perhaps they are a gift from His love to His child. Let's listen in. Hello, Steady On community, and welcome to this Stronger Together conversation. I'm Angie Bauman, and with me today, I have two guests, co-authors of a new book. I have Eliza Huie. Eliza, welcome to the Steady On community.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes. And Esther Smith also. Thank you, Esther, for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So Eliza, I'm going to introduce you both. Eliza is a biblical counselor, an author, speaker, and podcaster, director of counseling at MacLeod Bible Church in Virginia, and dean of biblical counseling at Metro Baltimore Seminary. That sounds like a lot of hats.
It is a lot of hats, which makes this what we're going to be talking about today all the more important.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And you enjoy the outdoors. What is your outdoor sport of choice?
I would say probably hiking.
Okay.
It really is just taking long walks in places that are quiet and serene. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you live someplace that is lovely, that you have close access to that kind of thing? Yeah.
Northern Virginia is beautiful. And I was in Maryland as well. Both really beautiful places. So yeah, there tends to be plenty of trails calling my name.
Good. And Esther is also a biblical counselor and an author and a blogger. And you specialize in chronic mental and medical conditions, right?
Yes, that is correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah, people with chronic pain, chronic illness, different mental health struggles.
Okay. All right. And you love reading and new recipes, and you have two dogs. What kind of dogs do you have?
I have two Cane Corsos. They're big Italian Mastiffs.
Oh my goodness. Those are huge, right?
They are big. They are very big. Yes. Our one is just over 100, I think. So he's getting humongous.
Wow. That's bigger than you. You're from this perspective, you look like a tiny little thing. So
he is probably about as tall or taller than me, at least.
Well, you'll appreciate this. I've never had a dog in my life until the last year or so when we adopted this little Shih Tzu, but he's 17 pounds. So he's just a little, your dogs would eat him, I think. So. Esther and Eliza have joined together to write what I think is a spectacularly important book, and it is called The Whole Life, 52 Weeks of Biblical Self-Care. And this idea of self-care, right, can be a little bit looked down upon in our faith communities, I think. And so one of the things you talk about is how we subconsciously sell every second of our time. And so I'm going to put this question first to Eliza. What does that mean to you that we are subconsciously selling every second of our time? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, whenever you see somebody and you haven't seen them in a little bit, or maybe you have seen them recently, you ask, hey, how's it going? And almost always people
say, busy.
Exactly. I'm so busy. And it's not even that every week we think, how can I pack my schedule so full this week that I'm just busy? It just sort of happens naturally. And I think there's a lot of reasons. One of the reasons I would say that happens is because I think we live in a culture that overvalues and maybe even idolizes productivity. Like we are we are so focused on, are you being productive? Like, what are you producing? What makes you almost kind of justifying your existence through how busy you are. And so that's part of it. Then I think there's just another reason why we just sometimes can feel guilty if we're not doing something. Like, we feel this because of that culture that we live in that's constantly, over emphasizing productivity. We start to feel like, well, I didn't do anything today. So, what does that mean? And so we just fill our time. And not necessarily even because we want to be so exhausted, but just because it naturally happens.
I think if I didn't do anything today, then I'm not worth very much today. I think there's such a link to that for us. I think, I know that's true in my life. I just had a conversation recently with a friend that I shared with her that God is really teaching me or inviting me to consider, what if you're valuable, not because of what you can do, but because of who you are? I mean, even just saying that, I can feel the emotion behind, because I'm like, I'm 46 years old and I don't believe that. I really like, and I believe that he says it. Mm-hmm. I believe that he means it, but to actually live out, like, you're valuable and I love you. If you, I wrote down, there's a scripture that you used in the book that's Acts 17:25. I'm going to read it back to you, but because it talks about how God is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, but on the contrary, he gives us everything that we need. And I think that's just such an important part of this in who are we working so hard for?
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Esther, how do we increase our awareness, you think, of how this is happening to us, this subconsciously selling our time?
Yeah, I think maybe it starts with just becoming more aware in general and paying more attention in general. I think a lot of times we go through life and we aren't really sure what we're thinking. We don't really know what we're feeling. We're making decisions without really slowing down. We're saying yes without taking time to really think about it, because there just feels pressure in that moment to respond right away and say yes. So I really think maybe it starts with slowing down and just and noticing what's happening in our lives in general, being more mindful of what's going on around us. And like, maybe on a practical level, not responding right away. So like, if somebody comes up to us and asks us to do something, I think there is that pressure to say yes right then. And something that I feel like over time I have become pretty good at doing is I will just say, let me think about it. So let me think about whether I want to take that on my plate or not, because it could be something that we do want to take on our plate and something that would be a really great opportunity. But having that time to really sit and think, is this something that I really want to add to my schedule? I think goes a really long way in helping us not fall into that trap of selling every second of our time.
Yes. And is this what I want to add to my schedule? But for me also is, will I be honest about what adding to this schedule means I can't do, or what I'm saying no to, or what because it sounds really good if I'm just like, oh yeah, I want to do that. But what is doing that cost me? Like, the whole, like, between now and then, now and when that happens. Years ago, when my husband and I first got married, we brought a considerable amount of debt into our marriage, and we spent a few years paying all that off. And one of the things that I was taught or learned, during that time, is if you think you want to buy something, like, put your credit card in the freezer, like in a block of ice or something. This is more like metaphorical, but, and then, like, if you get it out and defrost it or something and you still want to buy it, then maybe it's a good choice. But what it was teaching was what you're saying, that practicing the pause, right? Because it might look like you want to buy it, but if you think about it for a while and think about what the buying it costs you really, then do you still want to buy it? And I'm so good at that with my finances now, because I've done the work of, like, paying, years ago, whatever. I'm so bad at it with my time. I'm so bad at that with my time. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what's the alternative? Because we don't put our calendar in the freezer probably, but I'll send this back to Eliza. What do you think? How do we do this? Practice the pause.
Well, that's part of the reason why we wrote this book. I mean, both of us were seeing just how easy this was, and not just I think I first saw it in the counseling room when people would come in for counseling. And I just realized like a lot of what's going on there is what we're talking about here. Like you're just exhausted. But it wasn't just in the counseling room. It was also with my counselors and even with myself. And so what I began to do is like, I was like, there's got to be some kind of a resource that actually helps me know how to, just like you're asking, how do I actually like rest? What does that mean? Like, I know the Bible says that, but what does that actually look like when I can't like just quit my job, or I had young children, I'm a mom, I'm working, I was in school. Like there's a lot of things that I can't just tell my professors like, oh,
this is a rest day for me. Right. Yeah.
Life just has to keep going. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to make something really practical wherever you are in your life. And so part of it is just noticing and paying attention to what your life is like right now. Like, are you kind of burning the candle on both ends, as we say? Are you feeling that pressure? And if you are, to be able to say, okay, like Esther said, what kind of things do I need to pause and say, wait a minute to, or what kind of things do I need to begin to pay more attention to? So paying attention to my body, like how is my body doing? Sometimes it can be as simple as drinking water. I had somebody say, I don't even know how to start doing self-care in a way that isn't just like going to take me away from all my responsibilities. Well, how are you doing the first thing that you get up and do in the morning? What is it? Is it more your calendar dictating that, or your phone dictating that? Or is it, no, I'm actually allowing this space to be my time with the Lord, prayer, journaling, reading the scriptures, drinking some water, maybe actually having breakfast, not just grabbing a piece of toast as I run out the door. So a lot of that is noticing and then just being more intentional about what your life can look like, and what spaces need to maybe be highlighted and which ones, maybe we need to look at and reconsider, how am I filling this space? So that's just really I would say the first step is really just noticing and then taking those small steps. Because if you think of it as a big step, it can just be one more thing to do.
Yes. And we feel like a failure because we can't, right? Yeah. How do we incorporate small changes? Because small changes can really add up, is what I hear you saying too. Yeah.
And I would say one of the things that's kind of helpful, I think, for listeners, because I've been asked this question, is don't only think about it as what do I need to do? Sometimes self-care can be more like, what do I need to not do? What do I need to? And that's sort of what Esther was talking about, but I'm even saying in the small things, like what habits in my life have actually pushed out the space that I have to be with the Lord in the morning or in the evening or whenever you spend that time in the Word. What has gotten in the way of those things? So maybe it's saying no to certain things like our phones. That's been a big one for me. And I'm just really speaking honestly, like I have made the decision recently, like I don't even bring my phone in my bedroom anymore. It's just better for me. That's just for me. Leave it downstairs. That way I'm not tempted to let that be the very last thing that I am looking at before I go to bed at night. And honestly, it's that thing that I'm not doing that actually has helped me to focus on the things that I know are important for my life.
Yes, that's good. That's good. Hey friend, I'm cutting in right here to ask you a question. What message does your heart long to hear? I wouldn't have been able to answer that question before I became a student of the Enneagram, but now I understand as an Enneagram Type 1 that what I most want to be able to believe about myself is that I'm good. And by studying and applying the promises of God, I can know that I am good because I'm His creation, and God looks upon His creation and calls it good. Genesis 1. A fabulous group of ministry friends of different Enneagram numbers from the Red House Writers Collective have joined me for the Steady On Ennea Longings podcast miniseries. The miniseries includes episodes on strengths, stresses, and core longings of each Enneagram number, along with biblical truth that speaks to the messages our hearts long to hear. The miniseries also features bonus episodes on typing and mistyping and addressing concerns some Christians have about using the Enneagram. Many of the guests have even included their own ministry freebies in the downloadable PDF workbook. You can grab all of these goodies filled with powerhouse voices by clicking the link in today's show notes. Thank you for listening. Now, back to our show. Esther, we talk a lot about the idea of burned out. I think we use that loosely maybe, or even we don't even have would you define it for us? What do you think for you? What does it mean when we say, I'm just so burned out? What is someone saying?
Yeah. Well, maybe let me back up just for a second, because
Absolutely.
how I normally think about it is, and how we write about it in the book is like more of this, I guess, somewhat official definition, because if you will Google burnouts, then you're going to find that it's mostly connected with like workplace stress, and like being in a chronic state of stress. And there's actually like a very specific definition for it that you will find if you kind of look it up. And I think it's even a syndrome that you can find, that a doctor could even say that you have, that normally is related to you're really exhausted and you don't have any energy. You might feel really negative or cynical about work. And oftentimes there is this, you're not just performing as well at work. So that's kind of like the official definition. And we kind of go more into it in the book of just having just some of the signs of it that you can ask yourself, am I seeing these signs? Does work feel meaningful to me anymore? Or is it feeling less meaningful to me? Am I having various physical symptoms come up? Do I feel unable to relax when I'm not working? Are there relational problems that coming up? Is it difficult to connect with God? So questions like that. And I think that it's mostly associated with work as like an official definition, but I feel like I've definitely personally experienced it just in general in life, of just that feeling of being depleted and just not functioning as well. I think is like, for me, what I would think of just like, I'm not handling life quite as well as I think I should be. And little things just feel really stressful and hard to manage, that if I weren't burned out, these would be really easy for me to deal with. So I think
one of the things I notice in myself is a lack of patience, like especially with my children. It comes out, and I'm like, oh, when I just feel like they're irritating me all the time. That's not how I want to parent. I'm like, this isn't even accurate. But that for me, that's like a warning sign, because I'm like, usually your children aren't irritating all the time. Even when they are irritating, you usually handle it better than this, right? And for me, I can just tell that that's something where you're like, because you're stressed about something else, and they're like getting in the way of your like mental dwelling on something else. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Eliza, why do you think we keep pushing ourselves when we get there? Because, for me, a lot of times I think, well, if I just work a little harder, then I'll get to a place where I can rest.
Yeah, and it does go back to what I said at the beginning of just how much we value work, but I think it also speaks to our lack of understanding of what God has really called us to.
Yeah, why do we think living like this is biblical? Because I think a lot of times in our faith communities, especially, it's like that's the thing to do. If you're not exhausted or if you're not busy, you're probably not working hard enough, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're right. And I think there is a sense where we can even use the Bible to defend that, of just, we're supposed to live selflessly. We're supposed to pour out our lives. And there's a passage in Hebrews that says, I think it's the author of Hebrews, whoever that happens to be, says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And oftentimes I think that's not the word that describes how we're running. Instead, exhaustion is a better word. Like our version of that would be, let us run with exhaustion, the race that is set before us. But he says endurance. And if you're going to endure, you're going to need to attend to certain things. You're going to have to pay attention to the fact that actually, if the Lord put that in the Bible for us, he actually gives us a way to do it. He doesn't encourage us to run with endurance if there's just no way, I'm just so exhausted. And so part of it is, I think, a misunderstanding of what the Lord really has for us. And rest is one of those. It's one whole section in our book is on rest. And I think both Esther and I really understood, like, that's not something that people know how to do well. Like, we know it's in the Bible. We know there's a whole day that's supposed to be dedicated to this refreshment for us. But when it comes down to the practicals, how do we do that? And that's really what we want to provide, is like, here's some practical ways to look at your life, because I think that's what's contributing to why we keep going, is because it's like, well, I don't know what we
don't even know how. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think about that scripture in Hebrews you're talking about, and run with endurance. And I think I was thinking, is it's Isaiah 40:31 that talks about, right? Like renew your strength by waiting on the Lord, right? Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. And so to me, I'm making this connection, right? How do we wait on the Lord? Well, we spend time with him. We pause, we focus, we say no to other things, right? We wait on him to renew us. And if that's what strengthens us, and strength and endurance to me in my mind, and like, that's how we run. So it's like the pulling away, the time with him is what gives us the endurance to run the race. And yet that's the thing so many of us are neglecting, is that time with him, that connection with him. Yeah.
Well, and I think it does speak to the fact that we miss, actually, this is actually in the beginning of the Bible, how God created us. God created us as dependent beings. We're supposed to be dependent on him, but our world and our culture and the way that we live our lives is a picture of independence, of I can do this, I'll figure this out, I've got to take care of this, I need to do this. There's a whole lot of independence. And so in a real sense, what we're calling people back to is an understanding of what God actually designed us for, to need to be refreshed by him, to need to recognize our human limits and depend on him. And that's why we say this is actually rooted in creation, because when we rest, when we look at the seventh day where the Lord rested, we trust ourselves to the Lord who's going to keep things going. And so maybe, it's going to look differently in different seasons of life, but we really want to try to bring that back into focus for people, including ourselves. Like, that's definitely, I know I can speak for myself. Like, I need to be able to say, okay, practically, what does this look like? And so we give some of those things laid out in the book.
So Esther, can I put you on the spot just a little bit? What does rest look like for you in this season of your life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
and Eliza, get ready, because I'm going to ask you this.
So rest for me has looked a little bit differently in this season, because in the past, I have needed a lot of physical rest. I share in the book that I deal with chronic pain and chronic illness. And so in the past, I have mostly focused on just being really careful to rest my body, which I still need to do, and we still all need to do. But it's been interesting because more recently I've been needing mental rest. I think that, like, as we were writing this book, and then I was working on some other projects at the same time, and I just had all this mental work that was crammed into a very short period of time. And I just came out of that season feeling so fried. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, I just cannot even quite think straight. And so I have really been focusing on what does it look like to have mental rest, which for me has been things like stepping back from social media a little bit, not being on as much as I feel like I should be, but knowing that I kind of need that space. It's looked like stepping back from quite as much writing and some of that, like, more intense mental work as I'm able. Like, I have projects that I have to be working on, but I haven't been doing quite as much of that, like, optional work, I guess, if it's really mentally taxing. And then the other side of it being things like getting outside, spending time with my dogs, doing things where I'm not, like, taking in information. I'm not reading, I'm not watching TV, I'm not maybe even having a conversation. I'm taking a pause from intake of facts and information and taking in more of, like I said, being outside or spending time with my dog or something like that. So it's kind of been a good experience to focus on that. And I found it really helpful. I feel like that mental taxing feeling has started to lift. So
would you say at this season that you're comfortable with silence? I think a lot of us are uncomfortable with silence. I hear you saying things like turning things off and not writing and spending time with your dogs. But is that, if you're not, because I do some things like that too. A lot of times I'm passive listening to a podcast or something else, or, at the same time. And do you practice silence? Is that something that you're comfortable with at this point?
So I would say that personality wise, that is a practice that comes, like, more naturally to me than it might to somebody else. And then, like, for me, it's some of the more, like, communal practices. Like, I talk about celebration not being a very, like, natural spiritual discipline for me. So I would say that, yes, I do feel comfortable with silence. But I will also say that, similar to what Eliza was talking about with her phone, like for me, that's like almost like a pull to my phone when I'm trying to take those times of silence. That almost feels like, I don't even know where it comes from. It just like pulls me to it and I don't even realize that I'm doing it. So yes, I am comfortable with it, but I also have to, make sure that I am leaving my phone in the other room or doing other things like that, so that I don't just like automatically reach for it because I'm bored. I really think that that's what it comes down to sometimes, is like almost a feeling of boredom. So
what Eliza, will you talk to us about silence and then maybe some other things too? What does rest look like for you right now?
Yeah, I mean, silence is one of those things. I think if you've been a counselor, as long as both Esther and I have been a counselor, you get pretty comfortable with it. You have to get comfortable with it with yourself as well as in a counseling session, because we recognize, and not just because we've been trained to, but because we've seen it, that the Lord often is more audible, if you will. Like it's almost like we give space to the Lord when we pause the noise. And so I feel like I am comfortable with silence, but again, I think that has a lot to do with us in our career fields, because I train counselors as well. And that's probably one of the hardest things, is if there's been 3 seconds of silence, they're like, oh, I feel like I should say something. It's like, no.
We interject something. Yeah.
Actually, yeah. And part of that is really good intentions. We want to help. We don't want people to feel stuck, but actually sometimes the Lord wants us to sit in that place and find him there. But for me, so, it's not too uncomfortable. For me personally, that ties a little bit to how I practice getting rest and refreshment. And as you mentioned, like I do love to be outside, and I do like to walk, even just taking a walk, where I was talking with somebody recently and they're like, oh, that's so good that you walk every day. That's like physical, exercise every single day. It actually, for me, it has very little to do with physical exercise. For me, it's the mental rest. I don't listen to anything when I walk. I mostly pray and just be present on the walk. And I find that does a lot for my mental reset, as Esther said, but my emotional reset. If I'm feeling overwhelmed and stressed out by something, I will say that to my counselors. If I'm in a counseling situation with somebody and they are noticeably stressed, I have gotten far more comfortable with paying attention to what the body is telling you. And so I've been in situations where I've said, let's go outside. Let's just change the scenery, go outside. And it is amazing how just taking a walk, getting it doesn't even have to be super sunny, but just getting some different air, and seeing different things outside. It doesn't have to be a wooded park. It can be your neighborhood where you're just getting outside of your normal setting. And it allows for me to reset and it is a pause for me. But I do have to say, I am a little bit of a person where I do kind of have to be physically moving a lot of the times. And so for me, it's more restful to walk than it is just to sit.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you guys sharing those just really practical things. I think that's so helpful. And I think that's one of the reasons that I appreciate your book so much, because it is actually really filled with practical things. And I think the important thing for us to remember is that it doesn't look the same for everyone. And the Lord knows that. Like, we're created so differently. Like Esther was just saying, I struggle with this more and this is more easy for me. And, and so we're going to find things. But I think when we're exhausted and we just tend to binge watch something on Netflix, that's not the kind of rest that actually renews, right? That's just that sort of like falling over because I can't do it anymore. And the Lord wants more for us than that. I think that's one of the things that he's teaching me in this season. Like, what if I just really want more for you than this, like marching to this beat of the drum that just feels like it gets getting faster and faster and faster. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This has been wonderful and has taught me so much. Before I let you guys go, I love to close on this question because I love to share resources. And I'm going to ask both of you, just give us a peek into your life, if you will. What are you reading, listening to, studying? Anything goes that's just helping you connect to God right now. Esther, would you like to go first? Anything on your nightstand or on your playlist that's just meaning a lot to you right now?
Yeah. So, I mean, this goes a little bit back to the mental rest that I'm taking because I'm not actually reading a ton right now.
No judgment. That's right. Yes.
And I actually, interestingly, have been mostly reading fiction this summer. So that has been the mental rest that I have needed instead of books that are more study oriented. And that has just been really, really helpful to do that. But in terms of like something I'm reading that
Fiction works.
Fiction works? Does fiction work? Okay.
Anything goes. You know, it's so interesting. I'll just say, I have struggled to give myself permission to read fiction sometimes because I'm like, oh, this doesn't advance me like the way that some other things that, and I'm like, what are you doing to yourself? You love a good novel. Like, so anyway, yes. So encourage us with fiction. Absolutely.
Okay. So the book that I just finished is called Station 11. And it's by Emily St. John Mandel, I think. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right.
I'll look it up.
But it is actually about a future in which a virus has wiped out most of the world. I know.
This is very relaxing to you. No, I love it. It's funny.
And it's about a group of actors who perform Shakespeare in this like post-apocalyptic world, and about this rebuilding of society, and this concept of how survival isn't enough. And that's how, like, their kind of reason behind, even though the world has fallen apart, they're still traveling around in this troupe and performing Shakespeare. And there's a lot of other stuff that happens in it, but it's extremely well-written novel that I really enjoyed, and I could definitely recommend it. And it was a nice mental break.
Yes, I love it. I love it. How about you, Eliza? What's on your nightstand or in your earbuds, or anything goes? Or nothing. That's a fine answer too. Yeah.
I am reading right now. Well, just on a side note, I recently went on vacation and read a little novella. So it was a really small novel by a good friend of mine, Eric Schumacher, and it's called My Last Name. And it was just a sweet, endearing little tiny short read. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you. It's sentimental. It kind of pulls at your heartstrings a little bit. But what I am, as I mentioned, I'm growing more and more in what it means to care for people completely. Like the whole life is a really important title, because both Esther and I believe like it's all of our life. And one book that I'm reading right now that I'm finding really helpful is Sam Allberry wrote a book called What God Has to Say About Our Bodies. And I have really been enjoying just understanding more how much our bodies matter, and how we need to care for them, but also just understanding, what that means for us as Christians to live out this life, the calling that God has placed us in these frail bodies and stuff. So it's been really good.
Yeah, good. Thank you guys for sharing those. I want to share a scripture that's in the book. It's week 2 that's called Time Out with God. And this is a scripture that every time I read it, I can feel the tears behind my eyes because it's such a calling to me. And it's Mark 1:35. And I just want to say thank you for putting this in the book the way it is. But Mark 1:35 reads, "And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place. And there he prayed." And I just read that as we close for encouragement, because the Lord modeled for us this rhythm of, he was so busy sometimes. And so I believe that means we're going to be so busy sometimes, and there's good kingdom work to do. And there's a lot to accomplish. And the Lord is pleased with us when we use our hands and our feet to point people to him, right? Like we have these spiritual gifts, and we have this calling, and we have this need to trust him and depend on him, and to be willing to hold loosely the things of the world, right? And hold tightly to him. And so I just really, really appreciate your encouragement. It's challenging, but it is so needed, I think, in our Christian communities and our faith communities. So thank you both for just your obedience to work on this project, and for your willingness to share some of your own struggles with it, to be an example for us. We're grateful.
Great. Well, we hope it's a blessing to many.
Yeah. Thank you both for being here. Thanks to you both. And thank you, friend, for listening. Until next time, peace. In this season, I'm embracing rest more fully than I ever have in my adult life, or my teenage life, or my childhood, probably, for that matter. And I won't yet say that I deeply believe that I deserve to rest, but I do deeply believe God wants me to rest. and rest is an outward expression of my trust in his guidance. And so I thank you, Eliza and Esther, for encouraging me and all of us to grow. 1 Peter 4:10, again, this time from the J.B. Phillips New Testament. Serve one another with the particular gifts God has given each of you as faithful dispensers of the magnificently varied grace of God. To be a faithful dispenser of the grace of God means that we are also faithful receivers of the grace of God. My friend, I have a copy of Eliza and Esther's book to give away. New subscribers to my newsletter with U.S. addresses between January 12 and January 20 will be eligible to win. So visit the website, livesteadyon.com, and click the orange newsletter button on the homepage to sign up. And right now, new subscribers also receive the podcast mini-series on any longings that I mentioned in the mid-reel break. Next week, I will welcome author Bonnie Gray to the podcast. Bonnie is the daughter of a mail-order bride and a busboy from San Francisco's Chinatown. At age 39, she began a journey to uncover family secrets, and she and I sat down and talked about what God taught her about herself on the inside as she learned more about her story on the outside. If you'd like to support the ministry of Steady On, there are 3 things you can do, and they're all free. First, you can subscribe to the podcast. That helps a ton. Second, you can rate and review this podcast because that helps other people find us. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, you can also subscribe to my weekly newsletter by visiting the website livesteadyon.com and clicking the orange newsletter button at the top. And right now, that enters you for a copy to win the whole life. It gets you the mini-series on speaking to the core longings of your Enneagram number. And bonus, you'll get a message of encouragement from me every Friday. You'll find the links for all that goodness, along with many other mentions and resources from today's show in the show notes. I always welcome comments and feedback. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime by emailing steadyonpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. I pray wherever your day takes you, you are walking in the confident knowledge that you are a beloved, cherished child of God. Peace.